what I enjoy a lot about instrument acoustics is that preference to some degree is subjective. So you're applying hard scientific techniques to something that in the end is kind of subjective. And that's why I say it's science enhancing art.
I'm very pleased to have Tom Nania as our special guest on this week's episode of Life with Strings Attached. Tom Nania is an acoustics engineer at the Dario & Company, the largest musical instrument string and accessories manufacturer in the world. Tom's focus at the Dario is orchestral string design work under the guidance of Fan Tao. Tom Nania is also a member of the Violin Society of America's Oberlin Acoustic Workshop. Prior to joining the Dario, Tom worked as a luthier and acoustics researcher specializing in Archtop guitars as co-proprietor of the House of Luthiery. The Violin Society of America published Tom's work Archtop Guitar Dynamics in 2021. He is also the curator of ArchtopProject.org, an online resource for the acoustical analysis of historical Archtop guitars. As a lifelong musician turned maker, Tom's background in acoustics began as a collaborator with the PICO group, an astrophysics particle detection experiment located at SNOLAB in association with Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory. Tom graduated from Indiana University in 2013 with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Astronomy, and that same year, Tom attended Brian Galloup's School of Guitar Building and Repair, which was the beginning of a fruitful collaboration with Galloup's work in acoustic science, most recently as a member of Project Dreadnought. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Tom, and I hope that you do as much as I did. Good morning, Tom. Thanks for being here on Life with Strings Attached.
Hey, good morning, Jamie. Thank you for the invitation, and very happy to be here.
Yeah, great. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. It's you and I have been in and around each other, but not a lot of time to have direct conversation. And
yes, indeed.
Yeah, you do a lot of interesting work, and I have a lot of thoughts, but I am not. I don't have the education, the history in the way that you do. And so I hope to test some of these things and learn today and hopefully stretch each other's minds if we're open for it.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. I'm open for it.
Yeah, great. So are you in New York today? Is that where you are?
Yeah, on Long Island. Yep.
On Long Island. Yeah. Okay, great. Wonderful. So what's happening these days? Bring me up to speed.
Oh boy. Well, I have various projects. I always refer to them as my side projects, as they don't directly relate to my everyday work, but they're more kind of looking out for curiosities. And actually, at this point, I'm kind of getting pulled into a lot of these projects, and so it's hard to say no. I have a habit of saying yes, and because I'm so interested in the topic. For example, there's a Dreadnought project that's happening right now that I think we'll be officially discussing it maybe later this month at the Fretboard Summit, and then we'll be presenting at IBMA next month. But my personal interest in guitars is really archtop guitars and historic archtop guitars. And while I certainly appreciate the pre-war Martin guitars, it's not the first topic that I would choose to study as one of these side projects. But it's been fascinating. And just like anything, once you dig in and you start learning about the history and you start really looking at these instruments, it's really just fascinating.
Great. So there's been, I think that's part of how we met in the first place a number of years ago. Down in Cozumel, Mexico, was around that particular project, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's sort of the early days, or what would become this project now. But I guess it started back in 2017, working with Brian Galloup and Sam Guidry. We began CT scanning a lot of pre-war instruments. We started to do it. I used to work at a university, and there was a health sciences college as part of the university. And I just asked if it would be possible to CT scan instruments someday, not really knowing the point other than having great images of the instruments, looking at brace structure and things like that. And Bryan was able to bring a car full of guitars, and we developed a system to measure density for the CT scans, which is actually a very tricky thing to do. And so it's not so straightforward as it may appear on the surface to get a density value out of a CT scan. And so that is sort of an experiment, but then also getting these great images of guitars. Fast forward to now, one of those guitars is in a different collection, and we're doing this Dreadnought project, which is looking at over 100 1930s Martin Dreadnoughts, doing a very thorough inspection or investigation of each instrument and analysis, going from acoustics to play testing to high quality photos and interviews. And this guitar turned up in one of the collections that we were studying. And so we already had this rich data set from the CT scans. And so this guitar is now going to be a feature of the Dreadnought project, where we really do a deep dive into really the acoustics of the Dreadnought and how, as a physical object, it just vibrates and behaves. There's no bias towards any of the scientific investigation. It's really just looking at to see what this thing is and how it vibrates. And so there's some measurement techniques where you can actually do direct measurements of the vibrations of the instrument. And so it's really it's another tool in the toolbox, or just another lens to view these instruments through.
I've been there's been a number of people who are doing work in this direction, both in the guitar and the violin, as you're well aware, as well. And some of them are making instruments. Some are selling programs and classes on these things. And how do you test it in the end? And part of it is that there are people suggesting that you can recreate an instrument, that you can dial into this particular sound. But sometimes when we play those instruments, you wonder how they're connected to the models in which they show. Not everyone, but I've had the experience where someone has really gone down this road and then presents a guitar to me, and I have to say it doesn't perform the way I would expect it to. I'm very open about musical instruments, but when you're telling me that you use the model of this guitar and that you dialed in those tones and now this is it. If it doesn't sound like that guitar.
Yeah, that's kind of that's what it all comes down to. That's right. Absolutely.
And so for me, I've wondered a great deal about one of the super complicated things about the work that we're doing, the work that you're doing, and sound is that I've tried to break it down into sort of three simplest of terms for me to understand, not being a physicist, not being an acoustician of the sort. And I've been testing this sort of theory to bring it down into movement, measured by time, and perception are the three things we need for sound. And it's that perception part that's the trickiest one. Oh man, we can measure the movement, we can measure the time, but the perception, and so can you tell me how you deal with the perception problem? I mean, what if you're getting 73% of the data that you need, but there's a portion of it that is just, we don't yet know what question to ask, what to measure in that moment.
Yeah,
there are, and I'll wrap that up with one final thought on that. There's a neuroscientist that I've been listening to a bit, and my wife is reading her book currently, and stops and reads me paragraphs and such from it. And one of the things that she talks about that's really important to pay attention to with your brain, I think the book is called The Source, and I'm blanking on the neuroscientist's name right now, but just one of the key parts, which seems very unscientific, she just calls your gut. There's still something that's your gut instinct that you have to pay attention to, because we can't shape the words around it. We can't shape the specifics of it, but your gut, there's something that we can't communicate very clearly, but your body is still telling you. And it's that sort of undefined, those difficult to define things that are the parts that we have to measure so that our brain really does hear what we want to be hearing in these guitars. So perception, Tom, and asking the right questions. So how do you deal with asking the right questions and then the perception issue?
When I think of applied acoustics in guitar making, that it's certainly there's a lot of people doing that now. It seems to be a trend in guitar making. I think it's very early days for this sort of thing, and I think that we're just really beginning to make meaningful use out of certain measurements. And I think there are guitar makers who apply these ideas to instruments to a certain level of success, but it's not the whole picture by any means. And when I think about perception, I spend most of my time working on strings, actually, and this is a big part of string design and string testing. Is there are a lot of metrics, there are a lot of measurements that you can make in a lab, and that tells you part of the story. But there is, it all comes down to the player. And so if you, for example, build a guitar or make a string and you hit these tolerances, it really comes down to the player and play testing the instrument or hearing the string on an instrument. And even if the numbers look good, maybe the string doesn't perform as expected, or the instrument. And focusing on instruments rather than strings, I think that perception comes down to the adjectives that people use to describe sound. There's the preconceived understanding. If you've played a lot of pre-war guitars, for example, you have an understanding or a background of what those instruments sound like, what they feel like. There's a lot going on there. It's very complex. It doesn't come down to just a few numbers or hitting a few mechanical tolerances or even acoustical tolerances. There's a lot more to it. And so you have to listen to the adjectives that people use to describe sound. And you have to understand that people use the same word to describe a different phenomenon of sound. And condensing on what those words mean, I think is a very wide open topic of conversation, and something that's really just starting to unfold and be understood. It's interesting to compare blind tests of instruments. Now switching gears over to the violin world, and there's a lot of, when you hold an instrument that's 300 years old, or you hold an instrument that's 80 or 90 years old, in the case of the guitars, there's something to that that's very powerful. I think that's part of the perception, and that plays into how the instrument sounds or how you perceive the instrument to sound. The room also plays a huge role in that.
I mean, are you simply talking well, the room wouldn't make a difference in well, it could make a difference in psychoacoustics if you were perhaps at the Ryman Auditorium playing a pre-war Martin.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, it's almost like the most important aspect of trying a guitar out is what room are you in. I think there's a lot.
It is a big
influence
thing. Yeah.
Things.
Yeah. So, but I didn't mean to derail you there. So you were on a train and you were talking about an instrument that's an older instrument that if you've had some experience with them and such. But I mean, are you really just talking about, convincing yourself of something, or are you talking about that sort of unspoken sort of, just experience? You build a set of conditions within your mind that you may not be able to enunciate with a particular set of adjectives.
Yeah.
but everyone says, that thing, it's got that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there is a thing. When I play, not every instrument has it that's 100 years old. But a lot of the Martins from the 1930s do. And I think there's something. And I'd take the L5 as another example. Late late 20s L5s, especially for me, those are some of my favorite sounding instruments. And I think there is something to that age sound that you don't necessarily achieve in new instruments. You can achieve other things in new instruments, and who knows what those new instruments will sound like in 100 years. I'm sure fantastic. But there's something that I think time does do that cannot be recreated with a new instrument. And I was recently asked a series of questions about guitar making, and one of the questions was, how do you know when you've built an instrument that you're happy with? How do you know when you've achieved your tonal desire, in a sense? And for me, I don't think that that's possible to do once you string up a guitar for the first time. I think you have to take time into time as a factor. And so I would wonder what this guitar will sound like in 30 or 40 or 50 years, whether it's under a bed or somebody plays it. How does its sound change? And if you look at the violins, they do blind tests of modern violins and Cremonese or old Italian violins, for example. And there's about a 50-50 preference for new instruments versus old instruments. And there's one study in particular where they were doing blind testing, and somebody in the audience could actually tell each instrument, whether it be a Cremonese instrument or a modern violin. And it had nothing to do with how they sounded. It had everything to do with how the handlers held the instruments and placed them on the table, and how delicate they were with the historical instruments versus the modern instruments. And otherwise, it's sort of a wash. It's a 50-50. Some people can't necessarily tell. And I think there's some truth to that in guitars also. If you did a blind test of a great sounding pre-war Martin and a great sounding modern guitar, could well-trained ears tell the difference? It'd be interesting to know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I could. And so, yeah, are you convincing yourself of something when you're handling these old instruments? Is there something really there? To me, it seems like there's really something there. But it's really just fascinating. And I do a lot of oh, go ahead.
No, if you have, continue your thoughts, sorry.
It's probably just rambling on, so it's probably better to refocus.
All right. So, on this sort of perception side of it, I think the assumption is that we're talking always about the ears, and something that often comes up is that there is a feel difference from one guitar to the next, and that feel influences the way the musician is playing the guitar. I'm extremely sensitive, like to feel. I mean, to the point where I can't wear hats. I don't wear, this is probably too personal. I don't wear socks. I don't like compression on my body. Like I'm super sensitive to this. So I can tell almost everything I need to know about a guitar by walking up to in a noisy trade show, and I'll place my hand in between the neck and the body, and I'll pluck the A string with my thumb and just feel the guitar in my fingers.
Yeah.
And I can tell you probably greater than 90% what that guitar is going to sound like without the use of my ears.
Yeah.
Because of the feel of the movement. And I mean, it's that movement in time that our eardrum is receiving as well, right? And so I think we really underestimate that sort of feel of the instrument itself, and then how that influences the player. As you mentioned earlier on, the musician has a great deal to do with what the sound is going to be like. You can hit all the marks, but the way that particular musician attacks the instrument, how they interact with the strings, with the wood, it can make a huge difference. Of course, there are averages, but I remember years ago when I had a guitar store and I was bringing in these really remarkable European instruments that nobody had ever seen before. And we had a music school at the guitar store also. And I had all these great teachers who were mostly like top session players. I had really high level teachers there. And I had 4 or 5 of them play it. And then like the 6th teacher sat down and played it. Same guitar, same amp, same settings. And I was listening to him and I came over to the amp. I looked at the settings. Looked at the guitar. the volume, the tone. Okay. It sounded so substantially different. I thought something in the settings had changed. This person has a really low mass. They're fairly petite, very skinny fingers, a very different way of approaching the guitar. A Berkeley grad, a very competent, good musician. But he sounded so different on this guitar and amplifier than every other person who played it. I was shocked. But it was a real lesson for me in understanding how the musician can make I don't just mean a stylistic difference. I mean a serious tonal difference. The guitar sounded thin in his hands, and I didn't understand why at the time, but I know it to be true. Have you had such an experience?
Yeah, I think one other thing to add to the blind testing comment that's related to this question is, and your statement that there's a big difference between playing the instrument, holding it, and feeling it, or being 3 feet away and listening to the instrument. In terms of what would be interesting as some sort of study, to have a blind test of dreadnoughts and compare. It'd be hard to have somebody play the instrument and not know what instrument it is. But I think that you'd have a higher degree of people choosing the right instruments as the player, as opposed to somebody in the audience, because of that feel, because there's something to that feel, and you can really feel instruments. I have that experience also with strings. And when you're testing a string, if you're testing a string with a really great player, they can quickly accommodate and make the instrument and the string sound fantastic, even if it's not a string that they prefer. And so, and with guitar players, you can tell when Bill Frisell, for example, is playing a guitar. It can be any guitar. You can tell that he's playing that instrument. There's something that he's giving to that instrument that defines him. And there's a lot of players like that. And I think you get to a certain level where you can, your identity can really come through in any instrument that you play. And I think in terms of being, I've looked at instruments and thought that they would sound a certain way. I'm thinking of a Cassini guitar in particular, that you look at it and you think one thing, and then you play that instrument and it sounds completely different than what you had expected. And it just, you can just feel the entire instrument resonating and making a huge sound. And you're kind of looking at everything on the instrument, trying to figure out what is going on and how was this achieved. And that's always a nice surprise, certainly. And then there are instruments that you can play that are on the other end of that spectrum, that are not what you had anticipated, and maybe not in a not preferential way. Yeah,
underwhelming.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. I have yet to play a Cassini guitar, but I look forward to using them as an excuse to write off a trip to South Africa, though.
Yeah, very good.
No, their work looks really wonderful. We have spoken on a Zoom call, but I've never had a chance to interact with one of their instruments. And for those of you listening, if you haven't looked up Cassini guitars, I believe it's Cassimi. Is that right? I think. Look it up anyways. It's two guitar makers out of South Africa, and they do really remarkable work, both in quality of acoustic instruments attested by Tom, and it's certainly the looks. They're stunning looking instruments with a very unique look to them. And so, yeah, I look forward to that. So Cassini is not a sponsor of this podcast.
Oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should.
No, it doesn't matter. No. Don't think about that at all. This is all straight talk. Don't worry about it. I'm letting the people know that we just legitimately think they're good instruments, and they're not paying us to say it. So, anyways, so that's great, Tom. So listen. I sort of dove straight in on this podcast, but this work that you're doing, getting invited to these projects, you are, and I'm probably going to get this title wrong, but I believe the Chief Innovations Officer for D'Addario, something like this. What's your official title at D'Addario?
Acoustics engineer.
Acoustics engineer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But I work
Right.
in product development and research and design.
Yeah.
And
Right. Yeah.
and
Great.
yeah.
Something more to say about that?
No, not necessarily. The director of innovation at D'Addario is really Jim D'Addario, and he's
Okay.
the beacon for innovation here. So I'm
I
just a
don't
small part.
remember why I think that. Perhaps I remember seeing the job posting on LinkedIn, and I believe it talked about innovations in the job posting. And I know that you ended up getting that job. I had talked with Chris Griffiths about this a little bit and such. And Chris is an executive at D'Addario. He's chief sales officer, but I think Chris is more than the sales officer at D'Addario. But as many people are not solely defined by their title, you know. Anyways, I think that it was certainly they were looking for somebody who had the spirit of innovation. Anyways, when they were looking to hire your job, would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, that is true. And in our lab, we have Creativity Central is on the lab, and so you wouldn't think of a lab as being maybe a creative space, but it really is. And so there's a lot of creativity on all sides of D'Addario, from product management to product development. And I always think of acoustics and science as something that enhances art, and it really comes back to the musicians and to their response to strings, or if you're an instrument maker, to instruments. And and there's a lot that you can, as I mentioned earlier, that you can measure in the lab, but that only gets you part of the way. And there are more and more measurement systems that are coming online, and as technology becomes more accessible, the development of new test equipment and new lenses to view musical acoustics and instruments through, I think will help chip away at our understanding. And for makers who want to implement acoustics into their builds, by making an instrument, you're of course building something that has acoustics in there, but you can, maybe be more consistent in building if you're trying to hit certain targets. But we're really just in the early days of this sort of perspective, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see where things are in 10 years, in 15 years, and see how all of this develops. There's success with this sort of approach, I think, in the violin world to a certain degree. Violin acousticians have been studying, and makers have been studying the violin in a disciplined manner for decades longer than the guitar, I would say. And there's a lot of things that are pretty well understood. And what makes the greatest violin makers, I think, of our day successful is not that they are applying acoustics directly to their instruments, or that acoustics provide some sort of answer, or that there's some sort of formula for building an instrument, but it's actually more about curiosity. And what can these tools tell us about these instruments that seem to have been perfected 300 years ago or so? And violin makers are really trying to learn all they can from these instruments that have had their form, their form has been set in many ways. Innovations are small, but a violin still looks like a violin, and that's one reason why you can study it so intensively, is that it's such a standard form factor, whereas the guitar is totally different. I think it's related to strings also. If you look at like a phosphor bronze string, or the strings that acoustic instruments use, they're very similar in a lot of ways, and you can really change your sound of as a musician by choosing a different instrument. You can change strings, but you can also choose instruments of different sizes, different sound holes, different electronics. The violin is much more confined in that way, but there's a lot of variation in strings. There are so many violin strings out there that do different things to try to alter the sound of this very set pattern. in terms of the instrument profile.
Yep. I wish that was something that guitar players did more often. I think guitar players get used to a particular thing and they just stick with those strings regardless of what instrument they own. They'll use the same set of strings across multiple instruments, which can be a bit nonsense. And they just don't have the experience sometimes to know what that is. It's my experience as a retailer, and having guitars shipped into the store that I have to resell, and getting a guitar come in that every other guitar I've had from this guitar company sounds great, and this one guitar just doesn't sound as good as we expect. Taking off that set of strings and putting on a set of strings which I knew had a little more of this, a little less of that, brought that guitar into the space where we wanted it, and we sold it by changing back then a $10 set of strings. And the pick. I've sat between I've sat with a customer who was really like dialed in between two guitars, and they're stressing it's this one, but I like this about this one, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And eventually I looked at him and said, "What pick are you using?" Showed me. I said, "All right, that guitar, this pick, play it." There it is. Yeah. He was thinking the guitar was it, but actually it's a small change you wanted between these two guitars, and it was actually the pick you were using with that particular guitar. And so committing to one particular pick on all guitars also doesn't make sense to me. But I see most people do it. And I get it. I get that I'm more attuned to the flex and the response of one particular pick than the others. So I do have my go-to picks, but I also know that there's certain guitars, or if the strings are a little bit dead, I might change to go with a slightly lighter pick, which is going to give me a little bit more high-end response because it's not motivating the string as much, and I'm getting just a high frequency, because and you can compensate that way. Likewise, if a guitar seems too bright to you, you can change your pick and go to a pick that's a little bit softer in material and lose a bit of that top end, or roll the pick to the fatter curvature as opposed to the pick point. And you'll get a little more surface contact. You'll also roll off a little bit of top end in your playing. And I just don't see enough people doing that. They judge the guitar as good guitar, bad guitar. Well, give it a second. There are more variables here. So, and of course, you spend your day working with a company who makes a large portion of their money on exactly that, those subtle little details. Well, try this pick, try these strings, try this, the 80-20, the phosphor bronze, the coated, the nickel, whatever it happens to be. And I think that encouraging exploration and curiosity is probably a major point of what is needed for when you're dealing with innovative products. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the more I engage in instrument acoustics, and when you start off on this road, you think of the instrument and the plates and how they're vibrating, or the neck and how that is interacting with the system, the braces, all these, I'd call them maybe macro structural elements. And the more research that I do and the more I look into these sorts of things, the more I focus on the string and the bridge and that interaction and how much that can change and how important that is to the system, and how well does an instrument emit string energy, which then turns into radiated sound. There's measurements that you can look at to give you an idea of that sort of thing. And you can, I'm not sure if I should use any more guitar maker names, but there's a Archtop guitar maker out here on Long Island who does a lot with changing the bridge top for an Archtop instrument, changing different woods. And I think there's significant differences in the tone of an instrument by doing things like that, or changing a string gauge. You're considering the impedance of the string, how it relates to the impedance of the instrument, and that relates to then how energy is admitted into the instrument. And that all has to do with string guitar players, and the guitar community refers to strings and gauges, but I think about it more in tension. and
Mhm.
how changing gauge or changing tension adjusts that impedance, the string impedance, which then either better matches the instrument or can be matches in a sense that you have more energy being emitted into the bridge and therefore into the plates and the air cavity, or it can be blocked or impeded. So admittance is the inverse of impedance. And so there's a lot to say about strings and about attack and about that initial energy that gets inputted into the string by the pick that then translates into the saddle, into the instrument. And that's a incredibly complex system, and again, extremely fascinating. And the more you try to answer questions that you have, the more questions you get in return. And so it's always just digging in deeper and thinking about it in different ways. It never ends.
Yeah. Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. You know, everyone I know who's working in this field, of course, is as you draw it in, you get more and more specific. I'm exactly the opposite, where I am a major generalist, where I'm trying to understand things on, I hate using this term because it infers better. It does not infer better to me at all, but I'm trying to understand on a higher level, like the bird's eye view for me in the most simplified level possible. So, Konstantin Brancusi was very famous for saying, that simplicity is complexity resolved. And so simplicity is complexity resolved. And so I'm often trying to back it out so I can get the most simple understanding of everything going on so that I can then apply it to everything I see in the most simplistic terms possible. Let me give you an example of that. So I'm gonna test my theory here on you, Tom, hopefully, and see what you have to say about it. So my basic understanding of acoustics at this point in time, as I've already mentioned, actually, is I've boiled it down to, as I attempt to simplify, to movement. Energy and movement are the same thing in terms of physics, right? And so the movement plus time because we measure the movement in frequency within a given period of time, right? For how many movements within a second, right? So 440 hertz. Thank you, Herr Hertz, the German scientist who determined the movements within the second, right? 440 movements within a second is the movement of an A string of the violin. And that's what we use for our tuning system, right? And so the time is important because that's how we measure how many movements there are within a given period of time. And then the last part is the perception, because although I've tried to remove perception, actually it opened up my mind more, not shut it down, because movement and time received by our ear and the eardrum, which causes that membrane to move in time, which moves to our auditory sensors so we understand it and translate it into what we call sound, is the same equation for sight. Movement and time is also light, right? And movement and time, once I realized that, I thought, well, is it the other senses? And it actually is. It's how we perceive touch, smell, taste, is all different abilities to perceive our senses, translating movement and time. But it's the exact same equation until we get to the perception part. Follow me?
Mm-hmm.
So light radiating at a higher frequency, is a warmer light. We slow it down, so we insert time somehow by making it less efficient, and the light becomes cooler, right, in color. The heat that we feel with our fingertips, the sensitivity, or masses, whether they're very solid or less solid, we perceive that. And the difference between those things that are more solid and less solid is the amount of space between the molecules. And that space can be conceived as time. And so the reason that this is useful to me, and the reason that cheese becomes more pungent when it's left out and becomes warm. It's because actually as it gets warmed up, it's moving faster and it's coming across our perception more frequently. And it becomes, the smell is stronger for us. It's also the movement and time coming across a different perception. And so once I understood the movement and time and perception, I began to look at the system of the guitar. And let's take an acoustic flat top instrument, for example, because it's, I think, easy for most of us to understand. That it then all becomes about low frequency, high frequency, mid frequencies, and how we deal with the time issue. And so if we want more high frequency, we need to remove time from the system. And so you get a lot of high frequency from the strings because it's a very quick response, right? It's immediate. There's very little time in the system. If we want more low frequency, we need to make the system somehow a little less efficient to introduce that. Now, less efficient, don't jump on that right away, because sometimes what we're doing is we're actually thinning the membrane of the top so that we get greater amplitude. But that greater amplitude means between the peaks, it takes more time, and it translates as a lower frequency by the time it hits our eardrum. And so we may say that's making it more efficient because we're trying to get low response. Mm-hmm. But what I mean is looking at the system and understanding that high frequency has little time between movements, low frequency has more time between movements, and then shaping the direction of the energy into the parts of the system where we want it, keeping it from the system's parts where we don't want it through a series of obstacles and affordances, is the way that I now view musical instruments. Does that make sense, or is that crazy?
Yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. One note on time, and when you have a measurement that you take in a lab, or you use computers to measure something at a given sample rate or at a certain time, the human element is not in there. The brain is not in there. The brain is a powerful filter, and mm-hmm. and the brain does amazing things. I think it too sort of wants to generalize and look at things from a 30,000 foot view. And the reason I say this is because I recently was doing listening tests of violins, and when I first started to listen to each of the violins, you could tell subtle differences between them. And as you go back and re-listen to things, and eventually it all just kind of blends together. And I think that's the brain kind of averaging out what you're hearing. And mm-hmm. I had to step away for 20 minutes or so and give it time. And mm-hmm. when I came back, then I could hear the differences again. But eventually then mm-hmm. that would fade and things would blend together. Mm-hmm. And I think mm-hmm. that is psychoacoustics in action. And you can just consider a guitar and the fact that for a Dreadnought, for example, the air resonance, the lowest resonating frequency of the instrument is maybe 90 hertz, 93 hertz, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. The lowest string, though, is 82 hertz, an open mm-hmm. E string. And so that mm-hmm. frequency is actually lower than the lowest resonating frequency of the instrument. And so there's a psychoacoustic effect where you're hearing the harmonics of that low E string, and your brain mm-hmm. is doing a missing fundamental and adding that low 82 hertz pitch in there. And that's what you hear mm-hmm. as this low end instrument. And that's proven out in several ways. And the violin is similar. The lowest string on the violin is 196 hertz, and violin resonances, these air resonances, or the A naught as it's referred to in violin acoustics, is in around 200, above 200 hertz. And so again, you have mm-hmm. this missing fundamental. And if you want to create, say, a pickup for an electric violin, which isn't limited in its bandwidth by the lowest resonant frequency of the instrument, you actually have to roll off or put a high pass filter above the lowest note on this of that string, the 196 hertz, to make it sound more like a real violin. So it's and this relates right back to perception and the way that the brain hears things, and it's based on your experiences. And so for me, I often have to take the adjectives that people use to describe sound and apply it in some sort of mechanical way, turn it into numbers, for lack of a better phrase. And and I think there's a lot of art to that, actually. It's not all science. And what I enjoy a lot about instrument acoustics is that preference, to some degree, is subjective. So you're applying hard scientific techniques to something that in the end is kind of subjective. And that's why I say it's science-enhancing art.
Yeah.
And there's something really, really amazing about that. Special. It's goes back into this. It's sort of a never-ending quest. There's always more.
Yeah, I mean, our idea of, ideal. That's an awkward phrase, but our perception of the ideal comes from not just a set of measurable values. It comes from experience and emotions. We judge an instrument. You talk about Archtop guitars. I've shown many innovative Archtop guitars, but when I get to the traditionalist, they'll tell you this doesn't do the Archtop thing. And actually, many of those guitar makers don't like the Archtop thing. they find it to be a little too limited. They don't like the palette of the guitar, and so they make them more, modern's not a great term, but they make them a little more sparkly. They make them a little sort of richer and a little less defined, a little less punchy. But that traditional Archtop player is looking for that punchy sort of mid-range, the low mids to come out of an Archtop, which causes you to play in a very specific way. And it's the fact that instrument causes you to play in a specific way, which is what developed the body of work that we call jazz guitar. It influenced the musicians by its limitations, so that you end up playing very staccato. There's not a lot of sustained notes because they didn't sustain particularly well, right? And so you have to play very staccato, and you have to drive things in a very different kind of way. But when we get that instrument, which is defined by its limitations because it boxes a musician into a particular area, you have a level of creativity because, great design is actually known by its limitations. And so if it could do everything, you often would sound kind of like nothing. We know things because we don't know the voice of Willie Nelson and Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald because they're perfect, although Ella seems pretty perfect. It's actually because of their imperfections that we recognize the sound of their voice. And guitars are the same way. Yeah. And so the instrument, the new proposition of the instrument, because there wasn't such thing as an Archtop guitar before the last century, really, what we call now the Archtop guitar, which is often referred to as the jazz guitar, despite many guitar makers who don't want to call it that, doesn't matter. We view it that way because of the body of work developed around it, because there was a songbook developed. There's an established canon. And once that canon is established around that instrument, there's going to be a certain sector of people that will judge every single instrument experience by how well it represents the songs played from the book, the canon. And it will be a good guitar or a bad guitar, a good violin or a bad violin, based on how it sounds when it plays the book, the songs from the canon. And that's that part of that perception part, which is not... they've been institutionalized. I'm sure there's a university professor who will tell you it's jazz when it's this, it's not jazz when it's that. It's classical music when it's this, it's not classical music when it's that. And I guess you could work that into your equation somehow. But really, it has more to do with our experience, our empirical experience. And then, as you suggested, I will try and qualify what you suggested. I once heard a psychologist say that we see the world in a sufficiently useful low resolution. When we see a door, it's not very useful to us to say, oh, solid door, brass handle, 3 hinges, door frame. That's not useful. We see door as an object which we must move before we can pass through the space into where we want to go. And that's all we need to know at that point in time. At one point, you probably need to understand more about it because you don't know that you have to move this thing to get through the door. But eventually, that sort of fades into the back of our mind, and we now use the sufficiently useful understanding of door. And we apply that to everything. We apply that to the sufficiently useful understanding of the violins you're listening to. Even in the moment, your brain starts to sort of, this is a lot of work. Let's reduce this. Let's reduce. Okay, I'm willing to give this, 16 bits of my RAM and nothing more. You're taxing the system. I've got the spinning wheel of death on my computer brain. And it reduces until it's what we have to do. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. That's my experience, at least. And, I need to study up more on the psychoacoustics, but it's really it's hard to make correlations because of perception. And you almost want to, as you were saying, take perception out of the equation. But in the end, you can't.
Can't. No. You're I don't know, I've now spoken to a half a dozen acoustic engineers, physicists, people who really work within this realm. And one of them didn't like the fact that I used time because he had spent a lot of time as a physicist, and a lot of physicists don't like the concept of time, right? They really try and eliminate this idea of time. And he said, I think you're expanding the use of the concept of time. And I responded, I said, time is simply a measurement, like a centimeter or a mile. It's a defined point that begins and ends, and we all agree where it begins and ends. And so that we can measure the things that happen within that space. And that brought him back into his engineering side of things. Said, okay, yeah, I can accept that. But the physicist side of him.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Time has many meanings, just like the word warm or dark or
yes,
nasally or something, an adjective that's used to describe sound has different meanings. And
yeah.
From an engineering perspective, we can agree when something starts and ends. And it'd be nice if there's just a list of words that we could use to describe tone where we all agreed that this is where this adjective begins and ends, and this is what it means.
I agree, because I invited you to be a part of a panel discussion at the Venice Biennale to specifically see if we could develop a common lexicon around the materiality of sound. And we haven't established it yet, but as long as we keep having this conversation, I think that maybe our grandchildren will.
Yeah, we can at least try. Yeah, we can always try.
See. Yeah. So hang on a second. So working across multiple types of instruments and dealing on the science and engineering side of things, what are the most useful terms that you have? And then if you're willing to expose yourself, what are the least useful terms? The terms that you, every time you hear it, you're like, oh, I wish they would stop saying that. like tone. There's no such thing as tone. That's a mythical value, tone. Yeah.
Projection is an interesting term because I'm not sure how somebody playing an instrument can have a good idea of how an instrument is actually going to project into a large hall, for example. I think there are musicians who can do that, but I think projection is often misused, and what is really meant is loudness to the player sitting right there in the bubble of the instrument. And
how do you define the difference between projection and loudness?
Loudness is how something's, if you're playing a violin, for example, how it sounds under the ear of the player. So right near field acoustics, where you have it's more complex in terms of the dynamics of the fluid around the instrument or the air, and how you have almost like eddy currents that are swirling around the instrument that you can hear when it's next to you, but those cancel out, and those don't project out into a concert hall, for example. And so there are certain elements of the instrument that project sound, there's a lot of vibrations that happen. And this reminds me of a statement that you made earlier about how you view instrument making or guitars as, where do you want to focus energy? Where do you want to take energy away? You have all of these different patterns that the guitar, like the guitar top is doing, for example, where it's vibrating in different regions. And if you have two vibrating regions that are the same size, let's say, there's a chance that shape or that modal pattern will phase cancel out. And so there is energy happening in the guitar at that frequency. The plate is vibrating like this, but because it's vibrating in two equal halves, let's say, it's not projecting sound out into the room or to the player even. And so you could consider that as being maybe a waste of energy. It's going to happen no matter what, because if it's a low frequency modal pattern, as I'm describing, that's basically what's known as a cross dipole, that you can't do anything about. It's baked into the fact that you have a guitar shaped thing that's not too distant from a rectangular box, actually, when you think about plate vibrations at low frequency. And you're going to have that phase canceling mode. But if you tweak something slightly, like a brace, like the symmetry of a brace, if we're talking about archtops, or the plate graduation, you can make that. You can do something to try to make that symmetrical pattern asymmetrical, and at that point, that modal, that frequency, that resonant frequency, will radiate sound. And you can think of instrument tailpieces or pick guards or the wings on a violin bridge as, they do take energy from the system. But if you look at the violin in particular, if you look at the F-holes or the bridge design, there are certain elements that are filtering sound. You have those wings, as I just described, on the sides of a violin bridge that are moving, they're vibrating, and they are not radiating sound, but they're pulling acoustic energy at a certain frequency. And maybe that's by design. Maybe there are frequencies that you don't want a guitar to radiate, or you want to shift that frequency away from, say, a note that you're playing on the guitar, so you don't have this energy suck of the instrument body from the string energy at that particular frequency, which makes the instrument then sound unbalanced. And to a first order, I think that there are ways that guitar makers can achieve that and can look at that with basic acoustics test software, and just looking at where you're placing these modes, these low frequency signature modes that are dictated by the fact that you have a guitar shaped thing. But you can do something to shift those frequencies around a little bit. You're not going to make a drastic change in the shape of the modal pattern or the frequency, but there is a little bit of room to move on that.
Yeah. So structure is one of those things that everyone's always talking about, the braces, the top and such. And if you want to know who's measuring these things, they're all measuring the soundboard. And although I think the soundboard is obviously a major part of the system, I don't think there's enough attention paid to the other parts of the system. One of the things that I see very commonly amongst novice guitar makers, that their guitars sound a little bit thin, a little bit too top end on them, is they're using these massive slab fretboards, and they're stiffening up the system so much that they could actually reduce the top end by not having such a thick fretboard. And no one's talking about that. The amount that you can actually shift the fundamental note of the guitar by simply enlarging or decreasing the size of your sound hole, but everyone just makes a 4-inch sound hole.
Yeah.
But that air movement makes a really substantial difference. And for whatever, and we're all just 4 inches rosette. And
Yeah.
I don't understand why we're so locked into some of these things. The weight of the neck, which you did mention as part of the measurements that you've been doing with the systems, is really substantial. I interviewed a civil engineer who's a guitar maker, and we talked about its electric guitar design. But I said, how did your education as a civil engineer inform your guitar designing? He said, well, I knew I wanted a central mass. I said, what do you mean? And he has a very interesting electric guitar where there's an aluminum frame in behind, which holds an archtop, actually, at sort of nodal points. And he has a neck mass that allows you to move the neck sort of up and down, which I always thought was just that primary function. And it's a part of the function, but actually, acoustically speaking, he imagined a central column, as a civil engineer would do with a bridge or a building, and then two beams going off in either direction. And that would cause a central nodal point. And I've never heard a guitar maker talk about creating a central mass at the neck joint, ever. And I thought, oh my God, that makes so much sense. And has a great deal to do with why a bolt-on electric instrument responds the way it does versus the set neck instruments, is that central mass. But nobody's talking about it. And so I don't want to go sort of off track here, but in the most basic sense, this is how I hear acoustic guitar makers talk about the sound. That sufficiently useful low resolution version of understanding the acoustics would be rosewood equals bass, mahogany equals mid-range. And they actually think that the rosewood has more bass, when actually the rosewood is just the opposite. The rosewood itself will have a much higher tap tone than the mahogany does. What the rosewood is a greater obstacle. It's inefficient energy transfer from the top into the rosewood, and therefore the energy stays longer in the top, and so the top achieves a greater amplitude. And because it has a greater amplitude, you have more time between the system, right? So that's one of the ways you can insert time, is by making a less efficient energy transfer out of the top. So keeping the energy in the top and not allowing it to go into the sides. Whereas when you put the mahogany on there, the energy much easier moves into the mahogany than it does into the rosewood. It's a lighter wood, there's less mass to it, and it will absorb the energy faster, which means it has a faster attack, which is why the bluegrassers like it more than the rosewood. But it has a faster attack because of its inefficiency, or because of its efficiency. So actually, by switching from rosewood to mahogany, you've made an affordance, allowing the energy to move into a different part of the system. And so the rosewood itself doesn't have more bass. It's actually quite the opposite.
Yeah.
It has less bass, but it's an inefficient transfer. You can achieve the same thing by making an inefficient mahogany set of sides. Thicker, laminated, right? Solid linings versus very light linings with kerfs. All of these things will make a less efficient energy transfer, and it will stay in the top longer. And this is why, for me, it's become so useful to think of everything as that movement in time, and then obstacles and affordances. Where do I want the energy? Where do I not want the energy? I'm not allowing energy transfer. I'm robbing so much with that very thick fretboard. It doesn't absorb anything. And so you get all this high response. If you want the neck to start moving, don't strap a centimeter thick piece of ebony to it, right? You'll need to reduce that a little bit. And, a lot of people don't realize that Leo Fender's rosewood fretboards were so thin, they were bent onto the necks. The necks were radiused. And the rosewood is thin. As a matter of fact, if you cut the fret slots, sometimes you can see the maple through the rosewood. But that makes a much warmer sound. Because we don't have all of this high mass wood sitting on the neck. And so, again, because of that, you've made an affordance for energy transfer to go into the neck. And yes, sometimes you want energy to go into the neck. Because the system needs to balance with that central column. It's an interesting way to consider it. Anyways, is that Does that hold up for your thoughts, or is that madness?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I completely agree. It's interesting to consider tone woods, and this goes back into perception, and then these words that people use to describe qualities of wood, in a very general way, and the understanding of that is actually a little counterintuitive as you're explaining. And I think that's really important to understand. And what that goes back into is it's all about the top in a sense, because it's kind of a string by itself doesn't make much sound. A string attached to just a saddle doesn't make much sound. A string attached to a soundboard makes sound. And the first point of contact for the string energy to engage with the instrument is the top. And then that's going to dictate how energy spreads out throughout the rest of the instrument. And then you have the air coupled to the top that's going to start kicking in once the top starts vibrating. And it just comes back to that interaction between the string and the bridge and now the top. But it starts with the string, and it starts in the saddle, in the impedance matching of the saddle into the bridge into the top. You either have mismatch of impedance for the rosewood, a greater mismatch of impedance, or or you have a more efficient energy transfer into the mahogany because the impedance is better matched. Those numbers are closer to each other. So
if I can simplify that language for a second, if you will allow me to make a very simple understanding. So when the string is moving, I think one of our biggest problems in understanding sound is that we think of this stuff around us as nothingness, or it's not nothingness. We think of solids. We understand the solids. We understand liquids a little bit less than we understand the solids. But everything around us here we think of as kind of nothingness, the gases. But the gases are not nothingness. And if we think back to our science, we'll understand the ice, the water, the gas. It's the same. What the difference is actually the amount of space between them, the amount of time and movement between the molecules. And so when the string is moving within the gaseous space, it's not moving a lot of the gas molecules towards our eardrum. It's not able to move a lot of mass because it's very thin, just slicing through, right? Now, if you so we slice through here, you do it by your hand, you won't feel it. You turn your hand, and all of a sudden I'll feel it and I'll hear it. Why? Because I'm now moving more of the gaseous space, more of the molecules, and now it's actually impacting my eardrum. And so this string, which is what we interact with, is not capable of moving enough of it to affect over a distance to then interact with our eardrum. But once you put that string energy through a kinetic movement into the membrane and cause that membrane now, which is 20 inches long on average, right? And 14 or 16 inches deep. Once we get that thing to move, now we're moving enough molecules, gases, air, whatever you want to call it, that we can actually affect our eardrum.
Yeah.
And so we must succeed in creating a greater movement of more mass in order to get that sort of volume. We can get a pitch out of the string at a very low volume because it's just cutting through the air. Does that make sense?
It does. And one thing that I would add to that is that a string by itself in air for the ear, it doesn't have much of an impact. We don't hear very much of just a string vibrating. It's like plucking a string on an electric guitar, not as loud as an acoustic guitar. There's obviously some resonance happening with the electric guitar that makes the string energy sound louder to us, but the air does affect the string. We can't hear a very loud tone coming from the string, but the largest loss of low frequency energy of a string is it's basically lost to air, and so that's damping, that's string damping. So strings are damped at low frequency by loss of energy to the air around the string, and and high frequency damping is due to bending stiffness. And so even though, the air still has an effect on the string, even though we say we can't hear anything from the string vibrating in air, it's still affecting the string and still affects what we hear before the sound gets transferred into the instrument and into our ears. If that makes sense.
So the best example of this that I can help people understand is I recently had a conversation with the aerospace engineer at Lamborghini, and we were discussing this movement in air because, obviously aerospace, you're dealing with air, the gases a great deal and thermal management, but he talked about air separation and how the air is affecting. And we talked about the movement of sound through density, because actually whales communicate through a certain layer of the ocean, which has a density which makes it very efficient. There's been some tests, maybe the Heard Island test, I think it was in the 1990s, where they set off a sound and they told the scientific stations around the world to listen for this particular sound. And it was heard on the other side of the planet within 2 hours. It's because of the efficiency of movement within this density horizontal layer of the ocean that we can move so quickly, through this. Now, when we take that same concept and move to the air, that sort of nothingness that I just talked about, it's not nothing. Again, this is the effect of helium. So when we suck in helium, I always thought that it was making a physical reaction with my body, causing my lungs or something to change. He's like, no. It's just that helium has such a substantially less density that there's less resistance. And therefore you hear it at a higher frequency. It moves more efficiently. That is the effect of the gases. So if we reduced, would your guitar sound the same on Mars or your violin? Well, it actually wouldn't, because the gases are moving at a different rate and there's more or less resistance. So with helium, as opposed to what makes up our current air, the oxygen, the carbon, the nitrogen and such, if it were strictly helium, actually the note would be actually much higher, and because the resistance would be much lower. You'd have a higher frequency. Did you think through that before? I didn't. He completely changed how I consider helium and density of air. I had no idea, because we've all done it. We've all sucked on the helium balloon. We've all had the experience of it going up higher, and so that is evidence of the resistance we experience every day with the gases and sound. And I think that's the same effect that you're talking about with the string, is that it's not moving through nothingness. There is resistance. And the first thing you're losing on the low frequency is actually the resistance of the air around you.
Yeah, I think that I think of sound transmission through the ocean. You have these layers of maybe it's fresh water versus salt water, maybe it's different temperatures, but you have sound waves that reflect off of those different layers in the same way they do in the atmosphere. And you have, there are more dense air molecules closer to the surface of the Earth, obviously, because everything's being pulled down by gravity. And then that density changes as you get higher until you then get into space and you approach some sort of vacuum where we know that sound changes drastically. And so you have this gradient of that change by the time you're going from the dense air at the Earth's surface to space, where you have this vacuum of nothing, and it's not nothingness, as we know in quantum physics. A vacuum is not nothingness at all; it's all potential, and there's a lot going on there. But that's a different kind of nothingness.
But it draws things in, and there's sort of a movement. The whole idea that an object in motion prefers to stay in motion, right? And we're talking about resistance or lack of resistance, and that vacuum is the lack of resistance. Right. And so then things move much faster. Yeah. They actually, since the Heard Island experiments, they take regular sound measurements because of that time that we talked about, the distance between the space that we perceive as cold or hot actually allows them to take an annual temperature of the global oceans by how quickly or slowly the difference is in when they set off the sound and when it's perceived at the different stations. They know that that sound traveled at this rate, and therefore it's going through a particular resistance or less resistance, which is translated then into temperature. So the global temperature of the ocean may have risen 0.5% or lowered 0.5%, whatever it happens to be. And they measure that by movement in time and resistance or affordance. So if there's been an affordance where it moves faster, that means the temperature's gone up. If it's slowed down, that means the temperature's cooler. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just think about a guitar soundboard where you have, similar variations in density from the tree, basically. And yes, for people that are measuring physical properties of wood and, kind of looking at the general properties, like a general density for this piece of wood that's going onto an acoustic guitar, for example, or the speed of sound at one point on that piece of wood, but the speed of sound will change as you go across, the grain from the outside to the inside of the tree as it is. And, at some point you're going to hit a frequency in that vibrating top that is going to interact with that difference in density that is kind of, and I think this is one of those intangible things at this point where you're building a guitar and you think you have this piece of wood that has this certain density, but maybe that density is distributed, not perfect. It's not even. Wood is, of course, anisotropic, and so at some point that density variation is going to matter. But that sort of goes into it's not something you can predict necessarily. It's going to be an outcome of the instrument when the instrument is done, and however that interaction happens, it's going to happen, and it's going to change things slightly. And maybe that on its own doesn't make a big difference in the system, but a lot of those differences add up, and that can change things. And so that's why it's so complex, and that's why you can't just reduce it to a few measurements and think that you are recreating something, because it's so complex.
Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives, making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together. So let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going. One of those things that has come up recently, I was dealing with a physicist and acoustician who deals within architecture. Actually, it's one of our earlier podcasts, maybe episode 3 or 4, Zachary Bellinger. And we discussed the complexity of spaces is being reduced because of economics. At one point in time, we built grand spaces as kind of monuments to ourselves, to our kingdom, to our culture. It might have been started by your great-great-grandfather and you finished the church 300 years later, something along that lines. That's a hard argument to make to your investors. Right. And so these days, buildings are really, really shaped by production and value and how quickly you can turn it and sell it for and the profit margin, which is not historically necessarily how they've been. Famously, I think the country of France almost went bankrupt because the king was building lots of monuments to himself. It's happened more than once, I think. But one of the things that came up because of this, that actually the environments are becoming more and more reverberant because there's less complexity inside our structures. So if you go in like a Baroque building, there's tons of little sculptures and things everywhere, wood, stone. But we think of stone as very reverberant, but actually if you make a very complex stone surface, you can get it to absorb sound. It's about that complexity and making inefficient the movement, right? And so now let me take that concept, sort of the complexity. You take an empty room, you fill it full of objects, and they can be hard objects, and it will actually become less reverberant. It doesn't have to be soft objects like the ones you have on your wall, which are referred to as acoustic materials. All materials are acoustic materials, but that's another discussion. Go listen to our. So let me bring this together now. One of the things that we do as guitar makers is we adjust the size of our braces, and we think about the size of our braces in reference to the movement of the top. And typically, it's about having enough brace to make a stiff enough structure that the guitar doesn't implode. But we also work with the height of braces, making them less wide and more tall, as an effort to sort of give more membrane surface. Let's say, I don't know if they're thinking that way. That's how I think of it, right? So you reduce the contact point of the membrane, but not reduce the rigidity. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll get the structural integrity, but you'll get a little bit more low frequency response because the membrane itself is allowed to move a little bit more. But I don't think that maybe anyone or very few people are conscious of the fact that you're increasing the complexity of what's happening on the air movement inside the box by making those braces higher. And I think that if you look at the Bose company, Bose makes really remarkably tiny speakers that sound very big, very full. And they do this by making very inefficient movement to slow down the frequency response. So they make these long channels inside that they have to go through so that it can't just release. And what you're doing by making these long channels is you're introducing obstacles, which increases time. It inserts time into the system, and things come out at a slower rate. And coming out at a slower rate, we perceive as low frequency. And so by increasing the complexity inside the cavity of the guitar or the violin or whatever it happens to be, you can insert obstacles so that the air volume, the air movement actually is made less efficient and should drop your fundamental pitch of the air volume coming out of the instrument. And when we're changing our brace height, maybe it's so small it's imperceptible, but that's what I want you to answer. Have you dealt with this difference in brace heights as far as air movement is concerned, or are you always focused on the movement of the top with the bracing?
I would say in general, I would think about it as the movement of the top with the bracing, but only because you're opening up my mind right now to considering the air movement with the braces. And I just think that everything, it all matters. Every small step that goes into instrument making or violin string making, it all influences the sound. And on a first order, a guitar sounds like a guitar. A Dreadnought sounds like an OM. They sound like acoustic guitars on the first order. As you get higher up in order, second, third order effects, fourth order effects, you're starting to get into the minutia where these things start to matter, and they do add up, and they do then they are, the guitar sound is a sum of all of these parts, and the parts just get more and more infinitesimal as we look at these small changes that add up. And I think I'm at a point now where I've done a lot of acoustics research on old instruments especially, and I have a lot to consider and to chew on. But now it's about implementing some of these things I've learned into guitar making, which I think at that point will take the rest of my life to come to some sort of conclusion on that.
Yeah. Okay.
So more to come. Ask me in 10 years more, and
all right. We'll schedule
a better answer. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll send you a calendar invite when we get off the meeting here.
Yeah.
10 years from now. 2034, Tom, you and I will be a little more gray, but I look forward to it. Well, I mean, that seems like a great sort of point to sort of step off of here. Tom, is there a question or a topic that you wanted to discuss with me today that perhaps if I were a more insightful interview, I might have asked you?
So with traveling around the world with the boutique guitar showcase, how does perception change globally, like from country to country? How are preferences that maybe folks have in the U.S. or Canada? How does that compare to preferences in, say, Europe or Japan or anywhere that you've been? And what are the stark contrasts that you've witnessed?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The major differences as we go from one market to the next is to whether they were an originating market or a reenactment. And so the modern musics of the 20th century, the jazz, the blues, rock and roll, country, these things are really central to America. Also Canada and also the UK. So those are the centers of modern music, because really rock and roll was birthed in the USA, but rock music was really birthed in the UK. Where rock and roll became rock in the UK with bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and all of that, and the Beatles, the Beatles and such, and so those are originating markets. And there's many more Canadian bands there that get mistaken as American bands all the time also. So we're so close to what that is that there's lots of Canada and the USA. We're both parts of that, very, very tightly wound together, shared radio stations and such. As I'm around the border, if I'm close to upstate New York or Detroit or such, I'm talking to an older person, they tell me about watching SCTV, a Canadian comedy TV show, which eventually became Saturday Night Live in New York. And so because we shared radio, and people who I knew who grew up in Windsor were listening to Motown before it was popular because they got the same radio station. And so anyways, the point is there are originating markets, and then there are markets that were inspired by them are reenactment markets. And so the openness to new ideas and experimentation is typically higher in the originating markets than it is in the reenactment markets. So when you go to Japan or many European countries, they idolize it's a religion for them. It's church in many ways, and they want to go to church. And going to church means playing these instruments through these amplifiers, playing the songs of these people. I was inspired because I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1963. Therefore, I totally worship the idea of a Rickenbacker through a Vox, or, I want to play a Ludwig drum set, and all these things. They want to reenact that. And although innovation is always accepted by a very small percentage at first, the explorers, effectively, a lot of people had to go to Acapulco before the masses showed up. Right, there's a few brave people who went to Mexico and told their family it's very safe and the drinks are great and the beach is wonderful, and then everyone else shows up, and so that has a lot to do with perception. They don't quite know what to do with an instrument in the secondary marketplaces that doesn't immediately reference an icon, the songs from the book that we talked about, the outfit. If you saw a picture of if you saw a picture of Bob Dylan playing a Parker Fly in 1967, you would say there's something wrong with this. That's not right, So that's the biggest part with the perception is secondary markets want to really relive it. Of course, there are exceptions. There are innovators in the secondary marketplaces also. But then there's also cultural acceptance of the visuals. So we were actually just in Osaka, Japan with the Boutique Guitar Showcase. And there's a guitar maker there by the name of, who's Canadian, actually not far from me here in Ottawa, by the name of Michael Sankey. Mm-hmm. And Mike makes very organic looking instruments. Often you see the raw edges of the wood and such with Mike's work. And that was a huge success in Japan because naturally varnished raw woods, in this way are also very, very highly valued amongst the Japanese. And so Mike was kind of the star of the show, to be honest. He had 3 pieces there, and he felt like a superstar because we had retailers debating as to who was going to be allowed to buy the guitars.
Wow.
You know,
His work is beautiful. Wow.
yeah, but he's Canadian. He's not Japanese, and it doesn't reenact a musical style, but it does reference the reverence for natural materials and organic nature that is a deep part of Japanese culture. And so sometimes you can this term is used very poorly, exploit an icon. I don't mean exploit in a negative way, but you can choose to highlight an icon and bring that into your work and your design. People do it all the time, right? That's very normal. And so Mike didn't know he was exploiting a Japanese icon, but when he showed up there, that's what they were connecting with. Guitar plus organic culture was a hit in Japan. Bit of a ramble, but does that make sense to you? The sort of, you talked about first order and second and third, fourth order. So the first thing to understand is that guitar market is different in the originating cultures. And Japanese is a very close secondary market, probably because of American military bases during the explosion of the rock and roll sort of period. We're in Japan. You know, I have a teacup here that says occupied Japan on it, which is a very foreign and weird feeling for us at our age. But it was indeed occupied in that time period. And so that makes the difference as far as the psycho. Well, I mean, we do these things because we value them. And so I don't want to use the term psychoacoustics necessarily in a bad way at all, actually. I think we need to recognize when we're measuring it that it has an effect and that it's hard to calculate that effect. But our connection and valuing things because we have an emotional response and memories, and it brings us back to a time and a place that we feel good about, is part of the human experience, and we should embrace it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
in the end, it's the most important thing, perception, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. The trick is not to be fooled by your perception.
Yes.
Make a causal assumption that is just correlated.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the trick. So, well, I would love to keep talking with you, Tom, and I think we will. As a matter of fact, I think that I'm giving a presentation directly after yours in Chicago at the Fretboard
wonderful.
Summit. So we're going to see each other in a few weeks in Chicago, and this episode may actually come out after the Fretboard Summit. So I don't know that our listeners are going to have a chance to do that. But anyway, so I'll see you in a few weeks, which will be great, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. I hope this isn't our last time talking here on Life with Strings Attached either. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your experience and your work with us today. I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and certainly looking forward to seeing you and Roberta. Will Roberta be in Chicago as well?
She will, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Looking forward to seeing you both.
Yeah, great. Okay, so for our listeners, Tom and I are going to continue for a few minutes on our Patreon to discuss the business of guitar, which Tom will have a different perspective of for sure than some of our other guests. And so I'm looking forward to having that. So if you're not familiar with that, the Patreon is Jamie Gale, jamiegale.net. You can find it. And if you want to hear some more about the business of guitar, we're going to go behind the curtain to have some inside industry talk. So thanks for joining us. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. And a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.